Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Florida Sound Archive podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Kaiser. And for today's episode, I have on with me a very special guest. I am super excited to welcome on Barry Soltz. He ran a very important zine and label out of South Florida, Miami to be specific. Suburban Relapse was the fanzine. Sublapse was the label. Barry Soltz, welcome into the podcast. How are you?
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm doing great, and thank you for having me here.
It's a pleasure. So we have a lot to get into. I know that your Florida years may be far in the rearview mirror.
Yes, they are.
Well, like most people who I've talked to, we keep those memories close, whether they're in our heart and our minds, and we remember things over the course of our life where we get a chance to talk to people who we were friends with back in that period. We reminisce, we're a little nostalgic here and there. So I'm hoping that we can take this time today to go back down memory lane and revisit some of those times.
Sounds good. Sounds good to me.
All right, fantastic. Well, the first thing I want to share really quick here, in case anyone was not aware of who you are, one of the most important fanzines, Suburban Relapse. This is issue number 1. This, to me, is like one of my holy grails. I'm so glad I have a copy of this zine. And we're going to talk about that and get into some of the history and the origins of it. And also, in case anyone's wondering, well, what types of releases did Barry put out on his label, Sublapse? This happens to be one. And this record here has come up many times as an influence from many guests. So it's a very important record to a lot of people, amongst some others. So let's go back and we'll get to all those as we move forward. So let's think back to the early beginnings, Barry. So talk about your early periods growing up.
Well, basically, this whole thing started, I think I was in 5th grade. And whenever we graduated as kids, my mom always gave us $20. And so, to go out and buy whatever we wanted. And for some reason, she told me, you know what, why don't you just go out and buy yourself a record album? So I go, a record album. So I took her up on it, right? And the first record album I ever bought was Meet the Beatles. And that was a life-changing moment. And I went off to the races from there. The next week, I got a Herman's Hermits album. And then after that, Dave Clark 5's Greatest Hits. My first 45s were Walk Away, Renee by the Left Bank and Don't Bring Me Down by the Animals. So at that time, I was really into the whole music thing. We had several great radio stations, WQAM, WFUN, and for the R&B stuff, we had WMBM. And man, I used to listen to those stations. So my background is all the great music from that period. The Beatles, the Stones, Motown, Stax Vault, all the garage bands. I mean, Miami was pretty unique in that they broke a lot of records that weren't big in other parts of the country. So when I was 9.5 years old in 1966, records like You're Gonna Miss Me by the 13th Floor Elevators, that was a top 5 hit in Miami. Was not a hit like that anywhere else, maybe in Texas, but that was big in Miami. And we also had various Miami bands that got a lot of play. For example, let me dig this out. A great Miami band is the Birdwatchers. And they had big hits in Miami, and one of their big ones called I'm Gonna Love You Anyway. And so I just took all of that stuff in. And
Did you get a chance to see a band like the Birdwatchers? I know you may have been young.
I was too young.
Yeah.
I was way too young, unfortunately, to see the Birdwatchers. I wish I had. And, I missed out on a lot of that stuff. Actually, the first show that I ever went to was actually a rock and roll revival show in Miami Beach. And I got to see and meet Chuck Berry. I got to see Jackie Wilson and groups like the Five Satins. So, I mean, that was like maybe 1971 or so.
Wow. Now,
Yeah. So
your parents, your family, were they listening to some of that same kind of music, or did they come from an earlier generation where they were listening to something totally separate?
not at all. Not at all. We had a lot of Ray Conniff singers albums in the house. About the coolest they got was Frank Sinatra. Andy Williams was big. And yeah, they weren't hip to the music I was listening to.
Right.
The artist they hated the most was Bob Dylan.
Okay. Because of
They did
was
not
it
like the way he sang.
okay.
Not at all. But yeah, I mean, and then eventually I got really heavy into record collecting because I also got into 50s R&B, blues, and the group stuff, the doo-wop stuff. I got heavy into that, and I would go around town digging for old records and really just searching things out.
Talk about that if you can, about some of the record stores you can remember from back in that time period.
Well, I remember me and a buddy of mine, Wayne Ware, we actually walked into Deep City Records. Okay, but we were looking for older stuff, and we went in the back room, and there were all these Deep City 45s, and man, if I had a time machine to go back and get all those records, I'd be a rich man today. I mean, there was also a place on in Miami Beach called Jack Howard's One Stop, right? And he had supposedly the VJ warehouse got dumped there from Chicago, and there were all these, the back room was all 45s, $1 a piece. And man, the stuff we were pulling out of there, just pure gold, pure gold. I mean, and he was a tough guy, a weird guy, very weird guy. And I remember there were these guys from England, and they were piling up all these Soul 45s, right? And they were like, we're going to ask him for a discount. And I told him, I go, listen, man, I know this guy. Do not even think of asking for a discount. He's not going to go along with that. So we're sitting back there still going through records. All of a sudden I hear, get the hell out of the store. And he chased them out. They didn't get to buy any of their records. A lot of stories like that.
Absolutely. I think for many of us who have ever went to a record store in the last 30, 40 years, you've experienced something like that.
Yes.
So thinking about your Florida experiences, right? You went to these record stores, right? You interacted with some of these owners and what have you. How did you start to understand and know that these records were actually from musicians or bands that are out of Florida?
Pretty quickly. I mean, obviously groups like the Bird Watchers, but as a collector, some of the earliest, let me find it. Henry Stone, long before TK Records, right? He had a couple labels, Marlin and Chart. Okay, this is a Marlin 45, a Miami band by the name of Eddie Hope and the Manish Boys, a hard blues band, 1956. This record is a killer. It's a hardcore blues record with harp and guitar, and just absolutely killer.
Talk about that if you can, because I think for a lot of people, when they think of music from South Florida, especially Miami, the blues may not be the first genre that may come to mind. So was that something prominent going on from what you can remember back then?
I mean, I wasn't even probably born when that record came out, because I was born in December of 56. So that came out probably a little bit earlier than a year, in that year. But I mean, yeah, there were blues things that were out. A lot of vocal groups, just like, well, not big like New York City with the doo-wop scene, but there were vocal groups down there. There was a group called the Majestics that did a record called Nighty Night on Marlin, and Sam Moore of Sam and Dave was one of the members of that group. And so there was definitely a scene. You had guys like Rufus Beecham from the Tampa area. Ray Charles started playing in Florida. I mean, there's a whole scene. I mean, Henry Stone even recorded John Lee Hooker down in Miami.
I did read about that once upon a time.
Yeah, like in 1953.
Yeah, I did read about that.
So,
And
I mean, yeah, people don't realize that. And of course, the soul scene, which, I mean, a lot of great soul artists. I mean, obviously, folks like Miss Betty Wright. Okay. I mean, it was a very, Miami, there was a lot of things going on in the city.
absolutely. And just thinking about someone like Betty Wright, for example, since you just shared her record, I think a lot of people who may not always be familiar may know the song Clean Up Woman. But if you don't know Betty Wright, you should check her out, of course. Any memories of getting a chance to see her or interact with her back in the early
I
days?
never got to see Betty Wright, and that's one of my big regrets. Never got to see her. Of course, she passed away a few years ago. No, very unfortunate that I never did.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, very sad that of course she passed. And also recently too, Gwen McCrae passed away as
Exactly.
well. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I did get to see Jimmy Bohorn.
Okay. And where
I
was
did
that?
see, that was actually at a disco called the Limelight in Hallandale. And I do actually have a very interesting Clarence Reed story, aka Blowfly, because I used to work at the phone company in Hialeah. And so I was working down at the phone store, and this guy comes up to me and he shows me his phone receipt. He goes, "Listen, my phone got turned off." He goes, "Can you get it turned back on?" And then I looked at his receipt and it said Clarence Reed. And I'm like, "Hey, you're Blowfly." And he looked shocked that I knew who he was. And he's like, "Shh, don't let anybody know." And anyway, I got him hooked up, and his phone turned back on ASAP. But yeah,
Did you ever see him perform as Blowfly?
no, I never did.
Okay.
I always wanted to see him perform more as Clarence Reed. I mean, the Blowfly stuff is cool to me; it's fun. But man, as Clarence Reed, I mean, just to me, it's a shame he never got more credit for that material. He was a great producer, songwriter, and his own records. I mean, he made some great records under the Clarence Reed name.
Oh, absolutely. Completely agree. And you think about the sound evolution back then, as you got more into the 70s, you may have had more disco as well that played a part. Were you at all into that sound and that culture too?
I was, believe it or not, I was, and because there was, like, in the late '70s, before the punk thing, there really wasn't a rock scene in Florida, and the disco was pretty cool in the beginning because basically what they're playing was good R&B danceable records, and unfortunately it got co-opted and all of that kind of stuff, and you had Saturday Night Fever and all that kind of crap, in my opinion. But, I mean, I'm not knocking it, but
Sure.
I mean, just not really my thing. But yeah, I mean, there's so many great disco records that never get the credit for how good some of those records are. And a lot of them were just small disco hits, that kind of thing.
Did you know though some of the even larger disco hits were being recorded at a studio like Criteria in Miami?
Oh, yes, of course. In fact, TK Records was their office, and the distributorship was like 20 blocks away from where I worked when I used to work at the phone company. And I was very hip to all of that. And I mean, all those Gwen McCrae records, George McCrae, of course, Casey and the Sunshine Band, all that kind of stuff. I knew they were all local type things. Of course, right. Henry branched out and started doing like Euro disco and all that stuff as well, and just putting out all kinds of stuff. But I mean, the local stuff to me was the best.
Right.
because it had a unique sound. And, you can see the roots of that in records like Funky Nassau, Beginning of the End. I mean, what a brilliant, great record. I mean, records like that.
As the scene was even growing, and you were growing too, right? You're getting older.
Uh-huh.
How were your tastes changing with the times?
I mean, I always liked my R&B. That always was there. Um, I enjoyed a lot of the disco things. I was into bands like the New York Dolls. God bless David Johansen, who just passed away the other day. The Stooges, all that stuff. I got turned on to the Ramones, and I was into the Stones, all that stuff. But I really wasn't into that '70s rock sound. Boston, Kansas, all that
Right.
stuff. Pink Floyd, I liked their first record.
Okay. More or
That
less.
was it. Sid
Right.
Barrett,
Sid
Pink
Barrett's.
Floyd.
Yeah.
The
Sure.
other stuff I never got into, that kind of thing. So I guess, the punk thing that started coming along, to me, it was like a breath of fresh air at the time.
Right. And I can kind of get an idea of that entry point for you because you mentioned the Dolls, you mentioned the Stooges,
Uh-huh.
you mentioned the Ramones. I mean, there you go.
Yeah, exactly.
You're on your way. So,
Right.
how did you know punk landed in Miami?
That's a good question, and I'm not exactly sure exactly how I discovered it, but maybe through one of the music papers that was out, not necessarily a fanzine, but they used to have a paper called The Rag and all this. I think it was called The Rag, wasn't it? I think so, right? But I do remember the first punk gig I went to, and that was the Ramones at the Premiere AOR. And I don't remember who the opening band was. Maybe it was the Rolling Pins. I don't exactly recall, but I mean, the reactions were great. I mean, they were just, to me, they were like, I mean, not to compare them to anybody else, but if I had to make a comparison, it would be a band like the Buzzcocks or maybe the Ramones. Just great, short songs, love songs, that kind of thing. I mean, they had a great front person, Tony Supa. And I mean, he wasn't flashy. It was just real. And I was really impressed with the reactions. A few things I didn't like about that scene, because this was pretty early, maybe 1980, maybe 79, I forget. But I remember there were, I guess, some of the people there reading about what's going on in England, and they were doing the spitting thing at the band. Not cool. I mean, that thing is, I just never got that. It didn't last long in Florida, thank God,
Yeah.
but that was a turnoff. But the band I loved. I loved the band.
For those that don't know what that is, how would you describe what was that experience like?
Yeah, there were like I know Denise Rowe, who had a band, and her brother was in a band, James Rowe, but she was just like dancing up front and just spitting at the band members. And there was probably one other person, I don't remember who, but fortunately that didn't last long in Florida, thank God.
Yeah.
But that was a turnoff. But the rest of it, I really got. And what a lot of people don't understand, that scene was small. We're talking a club, maybe 50 people in there. In the
That is pretty
beginning,
small.
that scene was very, very small. I saw U2, right, at the Agora Ballroom, right? And I kid you not, 50, 60, 75 people tops in that club. I mean, the stage is right here, right? And there's Bono right in front of you. I mean, it was so small. I mean, the crowd was, that scene was tiny.
Yeah. Were a lot of these types of shows happening at places like the Agora Ballroom?
I mean, they got in some of the bigger bands. They got in 999 from England, who was very popular. I remember the Modettes. REM appeared there. They had a much bigger crowd. That's the only time I've seen REM. I'm trying to think. The Ramones played there. There were reggae shows there I went to. I don't remember which acts I saw, but just that's where the bigger acts would play. But I think it was Tuesday night. I forgot what they called it. Maybe they called it New Wave Night or something. But that's where a lot of the local bands showed up to play. Bands like the Screaming Sneakers, Charlie Pickett and the Eggs, the Reactions, the Eat, of course. One of my favorites. A lot of those kind of bands played there on Tuesdays.
On Tuesdays, I have heard some other guests mention some of those special nights where it'd be more new
Yes,
wave,
yes,
alternative type
yes.
music. Describe the people from what you can remember, the people who would go to some of these shows, other fans like you, enthusiasts. What do you remember from your people that would come to some of these shows?
I mean, it was we knew each other pretty much, right? I mean, for the most part, everybody was cool. I mean, I'm trying to remember exactly, but, we hung, over time, you get to know more people. We hung out. Sometimes, somebody would throw a party and everybody would show up. Yeah, I mean, we had similar tastes, I guess, in music. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly what else, to say about that,
Sure,
but
sure. Did you ever play anything yourself, being such a music
no,
lover?
no. And that's why I guess I started a fanzine.
That's
Dude, let me do something, right? Let me contribute something, right?
right, right. And a very pioneering fanzine, not just for South Florida, but for Florida as well. And I've done a lot of research, and there could be others
Mhm.
that maybe I may have overlooked. But Suburban Relapse, this could very well be one of the earliest
Well,
fanzines
the earliest,
out of
which I
Florida.
don't have a copy to show, well, this is another issue of when we kind of expanded a little bit. This is issue number 10. That's the guy there is Bob from Roach Motel from Gainesville. There's another one. But the fanzine that actually influenced me the most was Mouth of the Rat. Have you heard about Mouth of the Rat?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Dave Parsons fanzine, and I think it was a big influence on me as far as starting a fanzine, and as I recall, everything was handwritten, like really neatly handwritten, small. It was really cool, and that was a big influence on me. And then there was another small fanzine called the Borrington Journal that a friend of mine, Dave Funn, used to do. That was like a smaller thing, but I mean, eventually Suburban Relapse got national distribution,
Right.
so it went went all over the country, and I guess overseas as well. I would think.
What were your intentions? I know you were young, but what do
Right.
you remember about your intentions? Like, what was the whole purpose? Why do this fanzine?
I mean, I just kind of wanted to promote the music I liked at the time. I just wanted to promote that and, give a say to a lot of the local bands and that kind of thing, because we were kind of isolated in a sense from the rest of the country. I mean, our scene wasn't well known. It wasn't like New York City. It wasn't like LA. It wasn't like San Francisco. Even Atlanta had, somewhat of their own scene. So it was kind of like, let me promote some of this. And then, of course, as it grew, then I started doing stuff on non-Florida bands and acts. When I went over to England, I got to interview people like Nick Cave and people such as that for the fanzine. So it kind of built, but the foundation was Florida bands.
Did the fanzine help propel you to get more exposure out there to where now you could go somewhere abroad and interview someone?
Yeah, yeah, it was great. And also having a fanzine, it was great because I got all the promo records in the mail. I mean, I used to get stacks of records all the time. I mean, I remember Discord Records. They sent me their first 6 singles in a package. I got the first 6 Discord records, which of course I still wish I had, because probably the value of those 6 singles would probably be at least $7,000 or $8,000 today.
At least.
Yeah, right, right.
For those of us that never had a copy of the originals, they did release a nice box set a couple of years ago, which I do have a copy of, but it's not anything like the one that you want.
I mean, I was getting Touch and Go records. I was getting records. I mean, 4AD from England was sending me records. I was getting records from all over. So that, of course, I hate to say it, but it's true. That motivated me as well.
Sure.
So that was one of the perks of doing the fanzine, because the fanzine never made any money.
Were you still living at home when you were doing all the fanzines?
No, I was living in North Miami. I had my own apartment in North Miami when I started all this. I was in, how old was I? I was in my, let me think. Let me do the arithmetic in my head. I think I started when I was around 24 or 25. So I was older than some of the people in the scene.
You think that was an advantage to have that because you maybe had more experience, or maybe you were?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, I don't necessarily think so, but yeah, I was just a little bit older. I mean, there were some people that were older. I think Charlie Pickett, I think, was older than me, but there were a few people that were older. When I did get to see Smegma live, by the way,
well,
they played at a dive bar, and when I say a dive bar, I mean a real dive bar, right? And they played on top of pool tables. Okay, that I did get to see that. As long as that popped into my head, I figured, let me mention that. I guess Jello Biafra maybe later change the name to Teddy and the Frat Girls. I'm not sure. I see you had one of their members on recently, so I'm sure she gave you the full story of all that. But
she did. Spam Axe did come on from Smegma, Teddy and the Frat Girls, and there is a really good there is a good story about how that name did change, and I will put that interview in the description of this one so you can check that out too. And but thinking about that for a moment,
right?
Show like Smegma, how did you even learn about like when these shows were happening? Obviously much different back then, no social media, nothing really happening on the TV. This is kind of underground. So how did you even know this was happening?
That was real underground, because that kind of show was not promoted in print anywhere. That was just word of mouth. You'd hang out with your group, and then somebody goes, oh, so-and-so's playing next Saturday at this place. And so it was all just word of mouth. And I mean, that show, maybe 25, 30 people, that was it. I mean, you know, each show's 50 people, 60 people. That was it. I mean, the Eater, like, now well known all over the world, right? There weren't hardly any people going to those shows, man. It was a small community. It really was. And, you know, it started changing later on before I moved to New York City. And then you got a lot of the young kids, the skate punks and all that kind of stuff, which, I don't know, that just turned me off, to be honest with you. It really did. It was just not, you know, my scene, let's say.
I think with every scene, you're going to have some kind of evolution as the changing of the guard will happen at some point.
But
whether you want it to or not, it just happens.
I mean, but you know, and we had some great clubs, man. We had Finders, which was great, and probably the best club of them all. Flynn's was the best, man. That was just the coolest club. I mean, so many great bands out of out of state, and even bands from England came over to play there, and all the local bands were given a chance to play there. And it was just a cool hangout place because it was right on Miami Beach.
Right.
So you could like hang out on the beach. They had a swimming pool. You could hang out there. Everybody would hang out in the hotel because it was a hotel, and it was originally the bar was an Art Deco type bar, which I never knew at the time. Right? It was just the coolest place, and yeah, that was like our CBGBs.
When you look at some of the old flyers from Flynn's and you see these giant landscape calendars of all these bands that were playing at the at Flynn's, how did you kind of decide what bands you wanted to go see and check out for that first time, or perhaps even for the second or third?
I mean, I pretty much knew what I liked and didn't like. So, I mean, I knew all the local bands pretty much, right? And so that wasn't difficult to figure out. And, you know, and then the bands that Richard Shelter bought in from elsewhere, I was familiar with all those bands. So it was just familiarity, I guess. I knew all the bands. So I was hooked into, I guess, that scene at the time. So
you mentioned Richard Shelter bringing in different bands from outside, and Richard was a guest on the podcast as well. And you think about just knowing that information, because a lot of people I've had on, they would go to shows and see all these bands, but they wouldn't necessarily know who was bringing in the bands. How did you learn about that side of it?
I mean, just from hanging out and going out. I'll tell you one thing, though. The first Black Flag show was not a Richard Shelter show. That was at Finders. And David Camp and myself kind of decided, okay, we got to get Black Flag here. And Dave Camp was in touch with the band, and he went to, gosh, I wish I could remember the guy's name, but he went to this one guy who I think was manager of the Reactions, and he proposed this deal to him, and he put up the money to get Black Flag here. And that was the first, I guess you could say, out-of-state hardcore band to play South Florida.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was at Finders. And that was before Richard Shelter. But, and I remember I designed the flyer for it.
Okay.
I designed the flyer. And I don't have a copy of it anymore. Wish I did, but
yeah,
I've seen photos of it. So, but I designed the flyer for that show.
Was that flyer design, was that pre-fanzine or after the fanzine?
Oh, that was at during the fanzine. In fact, let me see if I have. Because we interviewed Black Flag. I don't have the issue here with the Black Flag interview, but we interviewed Black Flag, and we interviewed them on the beach because Finders was also on the beach. I think it was Hallandale or Hollywood. So it was also on the beach, and we just sat at a picnic table. Me and Dave Camp, we interviewed Henry, Chuck, and I'm not sure if there was another band member there, but I remember Henry and Chuck.
Was it just you and Dave that would do the most of these interviews, or were there other members of like the team that would also help out and do reports and that sort of thing?
I mean, Dave didn't do a lot of interviews, but Dave was involved with that. I know Leslie Wimmer from Open Books and Records did a few. Different people at different times would interview certain bands, and I'd say, great. Let's do it.
Right.
That kind of thing. I mean,
sure. Talk about Leslie Wimmer for a minute, because of course people may know her. Or if you don't, Open Books and Records was one of the most well-known and respected record shops back in this time period of going back to the 80s. And what are your memories of working with her?
Well, first of all, when you talk about her, you also got to mention Ted Gottfried, because they were partners in Open Books and Records. Right. And so Ted was as much a part of it as Leslie was. I mean, Leslie, first of all, also used to type out a lot of my articles for the fanzine. So I give a lot of props to Leslie for doing that. A very thankless job. And yeah, so I'm trying to think. Yeah, Open Books and Records was cool because they would just get in all the new releases. They would carry the fanzines. They would carry all the local records from the local bands, whatever band put out a local record. And yeah, I mean, just a real sweetheart, just one of the sweetest people you'd ever meet. And, you know, Ted was great. Ted, of course, later moved to New York City, and he started a store called See Here, which was kind of like a fanzine and bookstore in downtown New York City in the East Village on 7th Street. So Ted kind of brought that same vibe to New York City with the fanzine store. And yeah, I mean, they were great, man. I mean, and then they would order stuff for you. You'd go, hey, I hear this is coming out. Save me a copy, that kind of thing. And they would just order stuff for you. So It was cool. And you could trade in stuff, trade in your used records and get all of that.
Some of my favorite ads in the Suburban Relapse were some of the Open Books and Records.
Oh, yeah.
Ads.
Yeah.
Now, were these just favors because of the relationship, or did you actually get any money, anything monetary for putting ads in?
No, they were paid ads, but I mean, it was like $25 for a full page ad. It was very reasonable just to help pay for the cost of the thing. I mean, you know, like I said, if we broke even, it was good. I mean, the fanzine was not a moneymaker. I remember my dad always telling me, oh, you got to make money at this. Why are you doing this? You're not making any money.
And just speaking about your parents for a moment, because of what you're doing with this fanzine, you're going to these more punk alternative type shows, talking about more hardcore punk bands like Black Flag. Did your parents ever have any opinions of what you were doing in this period of your life?
Not really, to be honest with you. They pretty much didn't have much of opinion outside of my father saying, well, you got to make some money at this. And in retrospect, maybe he was right, you know? What can I tell you? But
Sure.
At the time, I really wasn't thinking in that. You know, we never made money on any of the records. It just basically helped pay for all the fees, the cost of production, this, that, and the other thing. I mean, none of those things made any profit at all.
Sure.
But, yeah.
And I think speaking about the records, I believe this was the first.
Yes, it was.
Catalog, Morbid Opera.
Yes.
Yep. So how did this record come to you to put out?
Well, basically, I was friends with the band. I was friends with Libby, Carmen, and Lisa. And we had just discussed, let's do a record. And, you know, maybe I can, you know, since I had distributorship with the fanzines and stuff, you know, maybe I could get it some kind of distribution around the country. So we decided that was the thing to do. And to me, it's important to have these kind of documents. For example, let's say a band like Crank, they were a good band, right? They never had a release, right? So they're not known. Morbid Opera is known. People know the band because there's that document, that record that's out there. And a funny thing about that record, that was mastered at Criteria, believe it or not. And David Camp told me, because he said the engineer there said that it was the worst piece of crap he ever heard in his life. So that was kind of, I guess, at the time, that was a badge of honor, I suppose. Yeah.
I would imagine, especially if you're in the punk scene. And you know,
yeah, exactly.
So, but yeah, so this was the first release on the label. Talk about the design of the logo Sublapse. So it's pretty simple, pretty basic.
That was designed by a friend of mine, Craig Snyder, and he designed the logo. And I thought he did a good job. It's kind of a cool looking logo, and yeah, he designed that.
Did Sublapse have any special meaning? Like, how did you come up with the name for the
No,
label?
no meaning. It was just kind of like a takeoff on the Suburban Relapse thing. I mean, the fanzine I named after Susie and the Banshee song, right? There's that song that they did called Suburban Relapse. And since, in a sense, I lived in suburbia, I didn't live in downtown Miami, I lived in suburbia, I figured, well, that would be a good name for the fanzine. So that's how that came about.
Okay.
And so Sublapse was just a abbreviated thing, with the sub and then lapse.
Right.
And that's how it went.
That's how it
That
went.
was it. Yeah.
So as you're getting ready to release the first 7-inch, which was not a single. This is an EP we're talking about.
Yes.
7-inch EP, but still an EP. So what exactly went into all that for you? Because again, this is a new venture. You've done the fanzine, but a label could have a whole different kind of vibe to it. So how did you kind of wrap your head around now we're putting out records?
I mean, we just, it was the band's recording. I mean, that was them doing that. That was totally the band coming up with the tapes. And, we figured out some artwork and how we're going to do it and just did it. That kind of thing. It was just, it's not, at that time, it wasn't difficult to get records pressed. Now, from what I understand, a lot of pressing plants, it's backed up. I mean, it was very easy to get a record pressed that, at that time. And I'm glad it wasn't during the CD area, because to me, vinyl is king.
Right.
Vinyl will always be king in my house, right? Vinyl lives here. Okay.
There's no doubt about that. So so that was the first release, the Morbid Opera 7-inch.
Yes.
Were you already contemplating at this point your next release after that one?
No. All these things just kind of happened. I mean, the Gay Cowboys In Bondage record, which obviously today you could never have that name. Very politically incorrect. And they got the name from what they told me was from a Monty Python skit. But yeah, however uncool the name is, or however improper the name is, Libby and I from Morbid Opera, we saw them at a warehouse party. I'm not sure how we found out about it. Maybe Libby I think Libby might have found out about it. And they were just a lot of fun. And, then they started playing the circuit, and that's how we talked to them and said, hey, you want to do a record? Let's do it. And that's how that went.
When you were seeing bands like the Gay Cowboys In Bondage, were these at some of the same venues you were seeing other bands, or did other places start popping up where you were seeing some shows there too?
I mean, there weren't a lot of venues. Let me put it to you. I mean, there really weren't. That was always a problem in that scene, because there's not a lot of places that wanted to book that kind of music. And I mean, I remember somebody, I think it was maybe at Finders, destroying part of the ceiling or something. That didn't go over good. In fact, I remember seeing the Bad Brains at some who, in my opinion, out of all the hardcore bands, nobody came close to that band. I mean, they were in a level totally by themselves. I mean, they were just incredible musicians.
Sure.
I mean, they were, they did the reggae thing and everything. They were just on a total different level. But I think they did something with the ceiling in the club or something, HR jumping up. But it was hard to get clubs. But I mean, the main clubs from that period, like 81, 82 to 84, maybe, I forget when Flynn's shut down, 85, were Finders and then Flynn's. Those were our main clubs. And I mean, the scene had grown a little bit, but it still wasn't big. It was still not a big scene at all.
Right. Did you find that bands like Bad Brains, although again, back in this time period,
Hmm.
they didn't yet become the legends that they would eventually become, right? So they're still kind of
Right,
a they're still, touring band, but still kind of a smaller
right,
band.
right.
So did you feel like bands like that were starting to build this interest and awareness of this whole punk and hardcore scene that was really happening in this early 80s period?
Yeah, I could see that happening. I mean, you know, again, Florida was very isolated, but I mean, I had taken trips to New York City, and the shows, of course, were much bigger there. You had more people, and yeah, I mean, I could see that all building upon itself. And I mean, yeah, Dead Kennedys, I think, came to like, I think I saw them in Tampa or St. Pete. They came there, and but
I've heard some stories about the early Dead Kennedy shows. Do you have any good memories of seeing them when you did see them
I
in
mean, I saw them in New York, and I saw them in Tampa and St. Pete. I mean, I'm not a big DK's fan, to be honest with you. I know a lot of people really into them. I mean, they were okay, but in retrospect, a lot of these bands, to be perfectly honest with you, a lot of the hardcore bands I can't listen to today. It just doesn't hold up for me. And it's interesting, right? Because a year or two ago, I bought for resale, and I paid good money for them. I bought the first Minor Threat EP and a copy of Communist Radio by the Eat. And I hadn't listened to those records in years. So I put the Minor Threat on and I go, what was I thinking? And I've seen Minor Threat live and they were good. But the record did nothing for me. I put on that Eats Communist Radio and I go, that's a great record. That record kicks ass. It's got a guitar break in it. It was just, it still sounded as good as the day I first heard it back in 1980 or whenever that record came out.
right.
That is a good record, man. It holds up.
And like
And I
thinking
guess that's
about
why it goes for so much money today, I guess. I
true.
don't know.
Yeah, it
Right?
is. It is a small fortune. And you think about though, when we talk about the Dead Kennedys and Jello Biafra, who I
Uh-huh.
think kind of helped to kind of rediscover bands like the E, because I think he wound up putting
Yeah,
something
yeah,
out
yeah,
by
which
them,
was a
reissuing
good thing.
something.
Yes. Yes, yes, that was a very good thing because he was a record collector himself. Those Maximum Rock and Roll guys were all record collectors. So, I mean, a lot of the people involved in this scene were record collectors, and they're collecting all these records put out by all these bands across the country. And I wish I still had. I sold almost all my punk records because I really wasn't listening to them.
Right.
And I wish I had those records today because, man, if I had that collection here right now, I'd be sitting on a nice fortune, man.
I believe it.
I could probably buy a condo in the Bronx with that money. Okay, for real, for real. Pay cash.
Right. And you think back though, again, going way back,
Uh-huh.
seeing a band like the Eat, you
Hmm.
likely didn't even have an inkling of thought that a band like that would ever become a name that anyone outside of South Florida may even know who they are. So what does that mean to you, be getting a chance to be a part of that scene and see
No,
bands like
it's
the Eat?
it's awesome, man. I mean, I probably been to like 30 or 40 Eat shows. I mean, there were certain bands I always went to see. I always went to see the Eat. I always went to see the Reactions. I always went to see Charlie Pickett and the Eggs. I always went to see the Psycho Daisies. I mean, I went to all the gay cowboy shows and Morbid Opera. That was a little bit later on. I mean, Psycho Daisies were later on because that was a spin-off group from Charlie Pickett and the Eggs. But yeah, back in the days, man, those were the gigs you went to. Screaming Sneakers were good. I liked them a lot. Yeah, those are like the main bands that I followed
Right.
from back then. Roach Motel for Gainesville were really fun. Sloppy as hell, but
That was the appeal, I feel like, to Roach
that was the
Motel.
appeal. I mean, Morbid Opera was sloppy as hell, but that was the appeal. They were very raw, that
Right.
kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it's great that these bands are known, and the reason those bands are known is because they have records out. Whereas another group, like I mentioned, that the groups that didn't have records out, they're not really known, that kind of thing, because they don't have that archive there.
Right.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
It absolutely is going to slip through because, again, there's nothing tangible you can refer back to. There's no document that shows they were here, except you might find a flyer with a name on it, and
right,
that
right,
that
right.
that could be about it. There was no video really. People weren't taking a lot of pictures maybe back then of some of those more
I think
local
there is
shows.
a reactions video, if I'm not mistaken, and there's a few Charlie Pickett and the Eggs things. I mean, I know there's one of my favorite YouTube clips is a Charlie Pickett and the Eggs video of them doing Trash Fever, which was Dave Frosch's song, and he sings lead on that. That's just great, man. That is just great. I mean, to me, Charlie Pickett and the Eggs, right? And the Psycho Daisies, man, they were just good rock and roll bands, man. I mean, they were like the Stones. I mean, I'm not necessarily comparing them to the Stones, but it was that kind of thing. I mean, they were based in blues, rhythm and blues. They had that thing that the other bands did not have, right? And that's appealing to me.
And how did
That's
that? And because of that, right? Because you think about a
mhm,
band like Charlie Pickett and the Eggs,
right,
and some of these other bands like The Eat or Morbid Opera or whomever else
right.
we were talking about. Charlie Pickett and the Eggs had a quite of a different sound compared to
Yes,
some of their contemporaries back then. So,
right.
how do you think that affected them, and especially for people like yourself who'd go check them out? Like, was that a highlight? Did you really enjoy that? Wow, this band is
I
different.
really enjoyed going to see Charlie Pickett and the Eggs. So first of all, Charlie had this guitar player, Johnny Sultan, who's just great. He was really one of the unheralded figures in that scene in my book. I mean, he was great. He could do really cool solos but not stretch it out where it's like a Grateful Dead solo that goes on for 10 minutes kind of thing. Just really good, concise guitar solos. I mean, man, I mean that they were great. I mean, the Live at the Button album, which I was at for the recording of that,
Wow.
just I mean,
Okay.
you know, yeah, I mean, and I'm actually pictured on the front and the back cover. I'm
I'm gonna have to
actually in
look for
both.
that now.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the front, they're small photos, but
Sure.
yeah, I'm there in the front, hanging out in front of the button with a couple other people, friends, and then in the back in the audience, because I was right up at the front of the stage, right, and yeah, that was just a great show. I mean, yeah, they're doing stuff like Tallahassee Lassie, Freddie Cannon songs and stuff like that, man. I mean, just great. I mean, I love that stuff. And then they did the Cowboy Junkie a Go Go record, where
Right.
they did all those, some of really good. I mean, Marlboro Country, of course, but you know, yeah. I mean,
I'll,
the
I'll
Overtown song.
I want to talk about the button though for a moment because a lot of
Okay.
people I've had on don't always remember that venue. And I don't know if they put on a lot of shows there. Some people may get it confused with the Button South, which I think came way later. So what was the Button? Talk about that if you can, from any memories you may have.
I mean, I don't have a lot of memories of the button because I didn't hang there, right? Because it was more like the regular rock crowd, I guess you could say, and whatever's, and it just wasn't where I hung. I mean, it was on Fort Lauderdale Beach. We did hang at the New Wave Lounge, which was kind of a place where they just played records, but they did have some live shows there, a few. But that was more like the hangout spot, just to hang out with your friends and
Right.
that kind of thing. But yeah, the Button, man, was not a place that I went to,
Okay.
but I was there for Charlie Pickett and the
Right.
Eggs.
Which,
If there was something good there, I would go. But I didn't want to see some heavy metal cover band, which was, I guess, kind of the things that they had.
okay, that makes sense.
Just not my thing. So
Right.
I didn't hang out at the Button.
That makes sense. Yeah. And another band you mentioned, Barry, was the Screaming Sneakers.
Uh-huh.
And they definitely had a look, especially the vocalist, Lisa Nash.
Hmm.
Any memories of seeing them back in that time?
Oh yeah, of course, absolutely. I mean, I remember seeing them, I guess, first at the Agora. I mean, I know they moved to New York and they did that mini album of theirs up in New York City. But yeah, at first she was, I guess, heavily influenced by Deborah Harry, Blondie. And yeah, that was cool. And, then they kind of started getting more of their own sound, I thought. And Gary Sunshine, I knew Gary fairly well, and good guy. And yeah, I mean, there was also another punk band called the Throbs, which turned into Crucial Truth, and they became Crucial T. But that stuff was more, I think that stuff was recorded in New York City. Yeah, I don't know if they got, I mean, there was the Abusers, which turned into Rock City Angels, which then they got a contract with Geffen. So that was one band that got a big contract.
Right.
But I didn't follow them once I left Florida. I didn't follow a lot of the local bands, to be honest with you.
Sure. I can understand you.
I mean, I did want the Psycho Daisies, because I did a compilation when I was working at Venus Records in New York in the late '80s. I did a Brian Wilson tribute album. I'll show it to you here. And I wanted to get the Psycho Daisies on that album, but we were never able to get it together. I thought they could have done a really cool cover, but some cool stuff. I got Sonic Youth to do something. Handsome Dick Manitoba from the Dictators, Nicky Sutton, a bunch of the local bands like the A-Bones. Billy Childish did a song. It was a pretty good comp, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, you had it sounds like, I mean, it's a good mix of bands and what have you.
Exactly.
And you mentioned the Psycho Daisies. It just didn't happen. Do you remember the story behind why they weren't able to be on that record?
They just didn't get it together. I said, hey, we're doing this thing. Why don't you record something? Send me the tape. Yeah, I'd love to have you. And they just didn't get it together. That was basically it. I'm not sure. I mean, I dealt with Johnny because I knew Johnny really well. And, but I don't know why. I don't know who was in the band at that point,
Sure.
but, out of the four main guys at the beginning, the album that I put out, which is this album here, Pushing Up Daisies, the only one that's alive is Dave, man. That's it. I mean,
wow.
The other three guys are gone. I mean, it's sad. I mean, they were great, man. I mean, that's a very good record, very underrated record, in my opinion.
I think it's a good time to talk about. I know you just shared yours.
Yes. Let's talk about it.
Talk about the Psycho Daisies record. Now, one thing that I find in common, this is just a little record nerd situation.
Okay, that's cool, man. I'm a record nerd. I admit
it. The labels of the Psycho Daisies record and the Gay Cowboys in Bondage are both that bright yellow, and Morbid Opera is the white color. I don't know if that had any.
Right.
If there was a reason, if you were maybe going in that direction, or if that was just an accident. I don't know, but they're both
that
bright
just
yellow.
happened, I guess. I don't know.
The labels are both bright yellow.
Yeah, I mean, it really fits on the Psycho Daisies because the cover is yellow, so that's cool. But that's got some great tracks on it, man. It really does. I mean, get off your porch, wrap your arms around me. It's a pretty damn good record. It should have done, to me, it should have done better than what it did. I mean, it did go into an extra pressing, or I believe, but then we got a ton of returns. But yeah, I mean, they were also really influenced at the time by the Gun Club. They were big Gun Club fans, so you can hear a little bit of the Gun Club in there. But it's kind of like a Stones record, man. I mean, you can't. To me, that's the way I look at it. I mean, I remember I listened to it. I hadn't heard it in years, and about 5 years ago, I put it on. I go, damn, that's a pretty damn good record. So, yeah.
Did you see the Psycho Daisies before you put out that record, or was that something that
Oh
happened?
yeah,
Okay.
absolutely, absolutely. I probably went to almost all their gigs. I even traveled with them when they did a gig in Gainesville. We all traveled in, I think, one or two cars. I forget, but yeah, I went up to Gainesville with them for them to play up there.
What was
They only
that
had a
scene like? Do you remember when you were up in Gainesville? Did you get a chance to really take in what was happening up there?
Oh yeah,
Clearly,
absolutely,
okay.
absolutely. I mean, you know, Roach Motel was the big band. I mean, that was the band, the big Gainesville scene band. But yeah, the people up there were really cool, really down to earth. I mean, I got along well with them. Yeah, they were absolutely. And I think the Roach Motel, if I'm not mistaken, I might be wrong on this, so don't quote me. I think their last show may have been at Flynn's, but I remember that show that they did at Flynn's at the very end.
Okay.
I do remember that show, but
I
yeah,
know
I
that
mean,
I didn't see Roach Motel until way, way later. They did some reunion little
oh really?
shows here
Okay,
and there, and they did play
lots
in
of beer, lots
there.
of beer.
Did you? Yeah, and they had many songs about beer as well.
Beer,
And
yeah, yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
so you going and seeing Roach Motel. I know the band side of it. What about the people that would go to see a band like Roach Motel? Do you have any memories of just the crowds?
Yeah, I mean, I was friends with a bunch of the people. There were some women up there I was friends with that followed them religiously. I mean, it's a lot of these shows, man, the way I look at it is these bands were just playing for their friends, man. That's really what it was. It wasn't like, you know, tons of people. It was like playing in your living room for your friends. I mean, like a friend of mine, the band, the Runaways, right? Yeah.
Of
Okay.
course.
A friend of mine, the first Runaway show was in his parents' living room. Okay. So it's
Wow.
that kind of vibe, man. It's
Yeah.
just you're just playing to your friends. I mean, the each shows there'd be 40, 50, 60 people there. Everybody knew everybody, man.
And that is something I have heard from a lot of people. And I don't know if you ever had those experiences yourself where some of these shows may not have necessarily been at an actual place like a club or
Hmm.
some kind of venue of some
Yeah.
kind, big or small, but they were happening in living rooms and
Yeah.
backyards and in the middle of
Yes.
nowhere. Did that ever
Yes.
happen in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, absolutely. Warehouses, warehouses where um, people store their stuff, but it's like an outdoor warehouse thing. Just drive up. They would just open up the gates to the warehouse, set up, plug in, and play for 10, 15 people. They're friends. Yes, yes. Gay Cowboys in specific. Morbid Opera, I did a couple things like that. I mean, I remember Charlie Pickett playing with Morbid Opera once, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, which is kind of unusual.
I
But
remember Libby and Carbon mentioning though that
okay,
Charlie actually played briefly. He played a couple
yes,
shows with Morbid. Did you ever see them
yes,
with
yes.
Charlie?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, if my recollection is correct, and you're kind of backing it up with what Carmen and Libby said, but
Right.
and you wouldn't even think that. But I mean, Charlie's a good guy, right?
Yeah.
Charlie spread his wealth around,
Absolutely.
help out other bands, that kind of thing. So yeah, that was
Absolutely.
cool. Yeah, but yeah, man.
Going back to the Psycho Daisies release, that was the last one, right? There was no
Right,
other
correct.
releases after that. So
No,
why was that the stopping point for you at putting out not
I
just
mean,
Florida records, but just records in general on your label?
because I moved to New York City, period. And I never pursued that after that. I mean, um, when I moved to New York City, there were a few local bands that I really, really liked. There was a band called The Willies that were just incredible. Female singer, real grungy, kind of garage punk, with certainly with an R&B edge to them, and they were great. And but after a while, I just got tired of the whole rock scene. I really did. I just fell out of it and got really bored with it. I saw some of the bands. I saw different bands up there, but it just, I don't know, man. I just got tired of it. A lot of it just started seeming very samey to me, especially the punk hardcore thing. That I just got real sick of fast. But
Because the New York scene and that mid '80s period was
uh-huh.
quite different than perhaps what you were accustomed to in the earlier '80s.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely, because there were
Sure.
more people up there, that kind of thing. I went to see shows. I went to see bands like The Fall when I first moved to New York, Nick Cave, Bad Brains, although they weren't anywhere near as good as the time I saw them in Florida, I'll tell you that. Nowhere near
Yeah.
as good. And I saw some of the big bands, Big Black, I remember seeing, but I don't know,
Okay.
I just got tired of it after a while.
Right.
I don't know. It wasn't clicking with me anymore. And that's when I started going back more into my roots, my R&B thing, and then got really heavily into soul music. And that just took over, man. you know?
Did you ever stop listening to that kind of like soul R&B even while you're doing this punk thing? Was it still
No,
there with
I
you?
still listen to it, I still listen to it, especially like a lot of the 50s R&B stuff. I always was a big fan of that stuff, but I wasn't as heavily into the soul stuff. I was buying soul records when I was a kid. I bought Aretha records, Otis Redding, all that stuff, man, but I was into it, but not as much during the punk period, but I never stopped listening to it. Good music's good music. I listened to, during the punk period, I would listen to psych bands. I'd listen to my 13th Floor Elevators records. I always listened to the Beatles, the Stones, and you know what my favorite rock band is? You might be very surprised. My favorite rock band of all time,
Your
the
favorite
Beach
one,
Boys.
the Beach Boy.
The
Well, I
Beach
mean,
Boys.
not a
That
total
makes sense
surprise.
because of this,
Right.
right?
Right.
A
Which
super Brian Wilson fan, me.
I was going to ask you, what period of the Beach Boys is your favorite?
I mean, I could tell you which periods are not my favorites. Anything after the Love You album from 78 on is not my favorite. I love the early stuff. Pet Sounds is incredible. I mean, albums like Sunflower, Wild Honey, Smiley Smile. The Smile album is, which eventually came out.
Right.
I got to see Brian Wilson perform Smile at Carnegie Hall, which
Oh,
was
wow.
mind blowing. And I
I
also
bet.
got to see him do Pet Sounds in New Jersey with a symphony orchestra. So those are my two times seeing Brian Wilson live. And I got to meet him once too at a book signing, and I gave him a copy of this, and he looked very puzzled. And I know he got a copy of the album because we were in touch with Dr. Landy, his psychiatrist manager at that time, to get permission from him to go ahead with this. And Brian was he was out of it, man. It was really sad. And I remember I brought him a cassette of Ronette's outtakes, Phil Spector outtakes, and I gave it to him because I knew he's a super Phil Spector fan. And he just kept looking at it and, like, is this for me? I go, yeah, Brian, man, I'm giving this to you. I know you're a Phil Spector fan. And it just, I don't know, it was sad.
Yeah.
But
yeah. Unfortunately, when someone's health has declined the way his has, it's just there is it right. So did you have any memories of it all of hearing about bands like the Beach Boys come down to play in South Florida back in the early 60s?
No, I really didn't. I really didn't. I went to school in Gainesville, so I spent 4 or 5 years up there. And I saw a lot of bands up there. Some I liked, some I didn't like, but the best band, my best Gainesville concert moment was seeing Muddy Waters, and I got to meet him backstage. And that was, let me put it to you this way. It's like, now I know what Catholics feel like when they get to meet the Pope, because that was like meeting the Pope kind of moment for me. And it was just a great show because there were 3 women next to me and my buddy that I went with, right? And he brought one of his 78s to have autographed. And they were telling us, oh, we're Muddy's cousins from St. Louis. And I go, I don't know about that. And we were partying with them and, passing a bottle or whatever. And then when we got backstage, we weaseled our way backstage, there was one of Muddy's cousins, and Pine Top Perkins had his hands all over one of Muddy's cousins. And so our suspicions were correct. But we got to meet him. Man, I got to shake the man's hand. His hand was so big. Just the nicest guy, man. It was that was, out of any celebrity I ever met, nothing will ever top meeting Muddy Waters for me.
What a cool story. To think that happened while you were going to school. I imagine that was University of Florida. Is that where you were going at that time?
Yeah, man. That was just awesome.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is. What a cool story.
Yeah. Blues, I'm a big blues guy. Jump blues, Chicago blues, country blues, you name it, man. And, I got into blues music early on, man. I got into it early on when I was still a teenager. Right. That kind of thing. Yeah.
And I know we're kind of looking a bit even further ahead now, but thinking about what you have been doing these last several decades since you went from South Florida up to New York, and that's where you still are, up in New York. Is that right? Yeah.
I live in the Bronx, the boogie down Bronx, man.
Yeah. So you being up in New York, right? You've been up there for quite some time. Have you had opportunities to go back and visit your roots down in South Florida over the years?
Not too much. To be honest with you, I don't think I've been down to South Florida. Gosh, I think when my father died in the mid 90s was the last time I was down there. I never went back. I don't know. I just never did. I got friends down there I would love to see.
Sure.
I'm seeing some of them come up here. I remember when Charlie Pickett and Johnny Sultan and that whole crew came up to see the Flaming Groovies in Brooklyn. And we all got together, went to, Jill came up, Jill Kahn. And we all went up and got to eat together and went to the show. That was great. And so I get to see some people like that, but no, I really haven't been back down there, man. I guess I need to make a trip, right?
It's changed obviously a lot.
I'm sure. I couldn't believe South Beach, man. When in the 90s, man, when I went to South Beach, right? Oh my God, because I remember working down in the phone company for a while in South Beach, and this was like during the Marialito boat thing going on. I
Right.
mean, Jesus, I would go out and have a monster Cuban lunch for $3, man. David Camp with Elaine was living in a storefront on Lincoln Road Mall. I mean, I don't even know what the rent would be like today in that location. I don't know, $30,000-$40,000 a month. I don't know, man.
Right.
Right? I have no clue.
You had mentioned briefly Jill Kahn, and I want to talk about her just for a moment because
Okay.
a lot of people who may not know, she had a lot of contributions to the scene
Oh,
down there.
absolutely, man.
So
Big time.
what can you tell us about your memories of Jill and what she did for the scene?
Well, she's a great photographer, and she just took amazing photos, man, documenting the scene, different bands. She's just a real professional, and she used to be boyfriend and girlfriend with John Sultan, of course, and kind of took care of him, basically. I mean, Johnny was not, he didn't totally have his life together, but she kind of kept him going for years, that kind of thing. And, but Jill, yeah, real sweetheart.
And a lot of her photos would later appear in a book that came out a couple years ago. Maybe not that
I didn't
long
even
ago.
know about the book. You're telling me something I didn't even know.
So there is a book that Joey Seaman and Chris Potash put out called
Oh, you mean that
Punk
book?
Under the
That
Sun.
book. That book I know. Yes.
That book. I
That book.
had a
Okay.
feeling you
I thought you
could.
did like a photo book or something.
I would say
No, I know that book. Yes.
I would say that the Punk Under the Sun could be the closest you are going to get right now to a lot of her photos that she had snapped
Yes.
back then.
Yes.
So you are familiar with the book, and
Yes.
when you had the chance to see what was actually captured in that book, what was your reaction?
I mean, overall, I enjoyed it. There were a few things, obviously, that were missed, but I'm not going to harp on those. But it was great to see that this scene documented. I mean, the later years in the book, I didn't. After I left, I didn't even read the rest of the book, to be honest with you. I didn't have a lot of interest, but I mean, they captured a lot of the things from the day, and I thought it was overall it was done really well, and I'm really glad it came out. It was great.
Did you have any aha moments where you said, "Wow, I didn't remember that story"? Did that ever happen while you were looking through some of
I
the early
don't
years?
recall any, but there may have been. I mean, you know what happens, and I can't give you an exact moment, but sometimes somebody will say something and I totally forgot about that kind of thing. And I go, oh my God, really? My memory's not always what it could be.
Sure.
But,
Well, you've shared a lot of really great memories with us here in this episode, and that has been just a treat to hear some of your stories. And again, as much as I love a good book that can capture, there's something different about actually sitting down and talking to someone like yourself and hearing them
I'm sure.
directly. Yeah. So it's always a pleasure getting a chance to do that.
Yeah. And, I mean, the last 25 years, I'm a record dealer. I buy and sell old records, mostly 45s. That's my specialty, and a lot of rarities. I specialize mostly in soul music, R&B, blues, some garage, rockabilly, doo-wop stuff. I mean, 45 RPM. Do when I can get good jazz albums, which are tough. I sell, jazz albums and, some rock or soul albums. But yeah, that's been my livelihood. And basically, I'm blessed. I really feel like I'm blessed because not many people get to do what they really love to do and make a living at it. And I've been doing that for 25 years, man. And that's a gift that, I used to work for the phone company in Miami. I hated that damn job. I hated it. So to be able to do what I really love to do, man, I'm a lucky guy, man.
And I think back about your original story when you were young and your mother gave you the
Hmm.
$20 to get you
Right,
meet
right,
the
right.
Beatles, thinking, okay, well, this is fun. I'm a kid. I'm buying a record, whatever. And then you fast forward all these decades later, and this is like what you do. Like you, but
It's what
you
I
love
do,
it.
man.
You're passionate
I
about
mean,
it.
I buy and sell records, man. I mean, Tuesday I'm going to this shop in New Jersey that bought the collection of a friend of mine who passed away a year and a half or 2 years ago. I forget. 2 years ago. And it was the biggest 45 collection by a single collector in the world. I mean, the stuff this guy had was just insane. And I've
Wow.
been able to be getting some great deals, be able to, I bought some stuff for myself, but
I was going to ask
just,
you about that because I know you're going there to obviously, make
yeah,
the
yeah,
income for
yeah.
yourself. But how do you work that angle where you're there
Well,
to
what
make
the
some
way
money,
I
but
work it, this is how I work it. The only records I collect are blues and R&B records from the 50s and early 60s. I love soul music, right? 60s soul, early 70s soul, whether it's the northern soul stuff or the sweet soul, whatever is, I don't collect that stuff. I don't go there. So I just stick with my little thing, and I just don't go into the other stuff because most of my money, the soul market is the really hot market these days. I mean, it's just through the roof, man. Because the Northern soul stuff, which is popular in England and popular here now as well, which is like the dance stuff, with the Motown beat from the 60s. But now there's like a whole Chicano scene in LA, and they're into like those lowrider ballads and the sweet soul records, and there's all these amazing groups now out out there that are just killing it with that kind of sound. And it's good to see. It's like a really really cool scene, and I wish we had that scene in New York City, but we don't. And there's so many performers here that you never get to see. Like one of my favorite soul singers, who most people would not know, but if you're really into soul music, her name is Ann Sexton. She made these great Southern soul records in the 70s, right? She lives here in the Bronx. She's never played here in New York City, man. She
wow.
can't get a gig, but she can get gigs in England.
Yeah. It's
You know,
I think when you talk to people from all types of walks, all walks of life, from different genres of music, that is a very common thing I can hear
really.
is that what's catching on here or what perhaps should be popular here is just not. It's
Yeah,
more beloved and appreciated overseas, whether it be in Europe or in Japan.
yeah.
They have a different appreciation for
Yeah,
music.
I mean, even somebody like Barbara Mason, who her big hit was "Yes, I'm Ready" in the '60s, right? She is worshipped in L.A. She's like a goddess. She hasn't played New York City in probably over 30 years. I mean, it's like what?
Right.
It's just. I mean, she's a legendary singer. I mean, Barbara Mason, man. I don't know.
No, it's a very
What can I tell
it's
you?
a very good point.
And I'm
And
glad I got to see some of the people I got to see live, because I didn't get to see a lot of people, when I was a kid. But since then, I've gotten to see some legendary artists and singers. I mean, I got to see James Carr out of Memphis, and he had mental issues. And I got to see him live. I mean, never in a million years
right.
would have ever thought I could see somebody like James Carr live.
Those are
But I
those
did.
those are those moments that if you don't go now, there's not going to be a later.
Exactly. You got to see
You
these
got to
people
go,
when they're
right.
still here.
You got to
I
go.
mean, Irma Thomas is out playing, man, the Soul Queen in New Orleans. I mean, I saw her do a show about 5 years ago, right before COVID hit in Coney Island. And the band backing her was just I've seen her 5 or 6 times. That was the best time I ever saw her because the band was right in the pocket and she was getting off on the band and she was loving it. And man, her voice is still great. And before each song, she would tell a story, like, because she did the original version of Time Is On My Side before the Stones made the hit, and she'd tell the story about, oh yeah, these guys from England, they did my song, and I mean all those kind of stories.
Right.
But I mean, you got to see these people while they're still here. I mean, Gwen McCrae just passed away, as you know.
Right.
I mean,
Yes.
David Johansen. I got to see. Check this out. And I posted it on my Facebook page. I went to this show 7 maybe years ago, and it was mostly a soul show, but David Johansen was booked on the show. And they also had Archie Bell on the show. Archie Bell and the Drells, tighten up. Anyway, the New York Dolls covered Showdown, which was an Archie Bell song. They did a duet. David Joe and Archie Bell doing a duet on Showdown. And let me tell you, man, incredible, man. It was and the love between the two, you could just feel it from the stage. I mean, it was just awesome. To me, those are the magic moments.
Correct. I completely agree. And just what a cool moment to be able to have that memory, but also have something you can even share too, to show others.
Now with the phones, man, we never had that back in the day, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
so that is very neat. Very neat. Again, very unfortunate that David Johansen did just pass, and very sad. Just anyone's decline like that, health wise. Just
I know it's heartbreaking, man. Jerry Butler passed away recently too.
Yeah,
I mean the Iceman.
It's been a busy year, I would say. For
it's been Jesus, not good, man. And unfortunately, as we get older, we're going to see more and more of that. And but that's the point. You got to see these people.
Sure.
I mean, these people are treasures, man. They're national treasures. I mean, I saw the Staple Singers, man, 3 times. God, hard. But Mavis is still here.
She is. So it is hard to sometimes put into words just what those moments are like, because unless you were there, it's hard to capture it just in a couple words. So
yeah, it is. It is. I mean, seeing Jerry Lee Lewis. I mean, Wilson Pickett. I used to go see Solomon Burke all the time at Tramps, man. That's the problem. We don't have a club. We don't have clubs that book these kind of artists anymore in New York City. I mean, I used to go see Solomon Burke, man. He'd play this nightclub downtown, and just, oh my God.
I can only imagine. Yeah, can only imagine. I want to talk about one other thing quick. We were talking about it before we were starting to record. There was a prior guest on the podcast, Blue Note Bob Perry, who a lot of people who ever went to Blue Note Records in Miami back in the late 80s, 90s, what have you, you probably ran into Bob or knew Bob or went to his store. So I know you have some story also with Bob that I'd love to share with the folks out there. So what are your memories?
I got 2 stories. I told you 1. I got 2 stories. Okay. First story is he had a blues show on WBUS, right? And I would always call in and talk to him on the phone, and we'd talk records or whatever. And I was maybe 14 or 15 years old. And I used to always say, man, why don't you play some city blues, like the Winoni Harris jump blues thing, or Charles Brown, Little Esther, that kind of stuff. And he wasn't playing that stuff. And then he goes, you know what? Why don't you come down and bring some records and play it on the show? So had my mom, I didn't have a driver's license, had my mom take me down to the station. And I mean, they must have flipped out when they saw how young I was. And I got to play some records, man. I played The Fat Man by Fats Domino on an Imperial 78. I played Faraway Christmas Blues, Little Esther and Mel Walker on Savoy with the Johnny Otis Orchestra, man. I had the time of my life, man.
Your memory is still sharp, but you can remember that level of detail.
I got some things, right?
That's impressive.
And the other thing is, because as I told you, I was always calling in, right, to the station. And one time he had Jerry Wexler on the show, and he put me on the air asking Jerry Wexler some questions. I mean,
Wow.
and I was 15 years old, and I was asking him like, "Oh, so the Clovers, man." I was asking him questions about the Clovers, the sax solo on "Don't You Know I Love You" or something like that. I mean, that was just so cool. I mean, to be 15 years old and
Right.
talking to Jerry Wexler on the telephone, it's just mind-boggling
And that
for
happened
me.
because of what Bob was doing at that time.
Yeah, 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 man. I mean, Bob's a cool guy. I mean, Bob knows his stuff, man.
Yeah.
I mean, he's been around. I mean, he was a promotion man. I mean, he got to meet all these people, man. I just can't imagine rubbing elbows with all the people that he must have met back in the day, man. Those are like my heroes. I mean, they really are. They're larger than life to me.
Right. I know when Bob came on, he shared a lot of really amazing stories. And I remember one vividly where he talks about picking up Bob Marley from the airport. Not
Right?
not
Right?
every guest
Can you
tells a
imagine?
story like that.
Right? Can you imagine? Right? It's
Amazing.
crazy. I
Crazy
mean,
stories.
I know, it really is. And yeah, I mean, some of these folks are still around, and I mean, I got to hang out one time at a small bar in Spanish Harlem with the soul singer Maxine Brown. She was very popular soul singer in the '60s, and she was actually recording. Later on, she did some sessions that Otis Redding was producing in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, which was a very different vibe than what she had done previously, because her previous recordings were more sophisticated uptown soul records, right? And she was telling me she was in the hotel room, right, working on material with Otis Redding, and one of his band members comes into the room, maybe one of the Barkays or something, said, "Damn, Otis, why don't you get that goddamn plane of yours fixed?" And you know what happened shortly after that?
Right.
The plane crash, and you know that just gave me chills thinking
Yeah.
about that. I mean, just horrific what happened. But yeah, but she did cut two recordings that never got released at the time with Otis, but they came out later in England. But yeah, horrific.
Right.
So I mean, to me, those kind of moments, getting to meet people like that, just it's special to me.
Absolutely. And I can totally feel that and see that. And it's so wonderful to hear those stories and some of these memories. I know you could probably share enough to fill 5 hours of an
I'm sure.
episode.
I'm sure. But you've been asking good questions.
Oh, thank
You
you.
that's the key. You're a very good moderator. Let me
Oh,
tell
thank you,
you.
Barry.
I give you a lot of credit, man, because you're always there with the questions. So
I appreciate it. And
you're moving it along.
I
I
appreciate
got to
you
tip my
and
hat to you.
thank you, sir. And
You're
it's just
making it very easy for me.
that is great to hear. And it's just, again, I can't thank you enough for the time that you've
No,
taken
thank
out
you.
to take that trip. I know everyone's trip is different
Yeah, I
and
know.
taking that trip
Hey,
down memory lane and just bringing a lot of these things to light because there are going to be people who are watching or listening to this episode who may not have realized all the contributions that you had made back
no, that's true.
in the scene. So,
No, 100%. People, I mean, some people will be very surprised if they
right.
listen to the whole episode.
And
But
they should. They should.
it's me. That's
It's
it.
you.
It's me.
Absolutely. And as we get ready to close things out, I always like to give my guests the last word. Any final thoughts you want to share to close us out and take us home? I'm going to turn it over to you to do that.
Um, I don't know. I don't really have a special thing. I mean, I just appreciate this opportunity that you've given me to share my stories. And hey, God bless everyone. And God bless you. And, go see your heroes while they're still alive. Go see whoever that might be, whether it's Paul McCartney, whoever it is, Gladys Knight, whoever your heroes are, go and see them and support them and go support the music because that's where it's at. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Jeff. Thank you again.